the promoters all got their exclusive deals on these networks, and they held it as walled. They try to make them walled gardens like MMA, and it's just the product is not as interesting, and so they hurt themselves that way. So it's hard to feel sorry for a lot of the boxing stakeholders because they put themselves in the situation.
Right. Because you mentioned wrestling earlier as an example of the monopolization, if you want to call it that. And with the WWE, like they really exploded in the mid 1980s, for people who don't know this, where there was a healthy independent scene, or at the time called a territory period, the territory days, the territory era, where you would have professional wrestling promotions, all different parts of the country. You had Georgia Championship Wrestling, you had Florida Championship Wrestling, you had World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas, you had the AWA, as we mentioned before we started, in the Midwest and Minnesota. You had promotion in California. You had New York, quote unquote, which was the WWF at the time. And eventually Vince McMahon just bought out his competition, just little by little by little. There are some people you talk to who think that maybe Bill Watts would have eventually done that, or somebody else if Vince McMahon didn't, but ultimately Vince did it. And it killed the territories to the point where in the 90s, it was WWF, WCW, you had ECW, you had what was left of the NWA, which had a lot of affiliations with these territories at one point. And that was it. And then eventually Vince McMahon and WWF bought WCW, bought ECW, to the point where they had to create their own competition, with Raw and SmackDown splitting up because they had so many wrestlers that they didn't even know what to do with. And they had multiple developmental systems. So they had their monopoly. And the independent wrestling scene hasn't been healthy in a while. In the 2000s, you still had like Ring of Honor and Chikara, but it wasn't the same as early on. And now like a lot of those promotions don't even exist. It's kind of WWE, AEW, and good luck with everything else. And then with MMA, obviously UFC has risen to prominence, and Pride doesn't exist, Bellator doesn't exist, and like there are other promotions where they came and went during all that. And for boxing, it looks like we could be headed there, where I mean, Ring Magazine is part of this. Like it's part. The accounts and the company has become essentially a propaganda arm for everything that they're doing. So it's very conceivable that the Ring Magazine titles are just the titles that get folded over into this. And then what you don't have is kind of like in WWE, to compete for the WWE Championship, you're typically not a wrestler coming from New Japan Pro Wrestling in order to do that. You have to sign with the WWE in order to do that first. Same thing with MMA and the UFC. Whoever's the top person in another promotion, they have to sign with the UFC and vacate whatever title they're leaving behind from that other promotion to come here, which is to say, if this happens and they have this UBO, what's going to end up happening is if the WBC champion wants to fight the Ring champion or whatever, the Zuffa champion, yeah, they're going to have to vacate. It's not going to be a unification like it would have been maybe at one point. They're just going to have to vacate the title. And that just makes everything where it's like, all right, you're going to have to pay. And it's going to cost more money for the consumer, because we talked about, hey, should consumers care about this? Should fans care about this? I think it's going to cost them more money, because then you're going to have to pay, for it's going to be just subscription service after subscription service after subscription service for like different things. And the Zone's talked about getting rid of pay-per-view. We both know that they're just going to up the price for the Zone. Like we know that that's going to happen along the way.
Yeah, it's they'll do some. I mean, they might do some predatory pricing to put others out of business, and then raise the price when they have control. I mean, look at the UFC again. It's you have a paywall for ESPN Plus right now, and Fight Pass. You want to get all the content, and then 12 to 14 events per year on pay-per-view. Never mind that a lot of those events probably should not be pay-per-view events, but they have the fans conditioned. So it's not a cheap sport to watch. Boxing's the same. They keep putting stuff on pay-per-view that probably shouldn't be on pay-per-view, but part of that is because the promoters did not work together and build up enough interest in the product to have better broadcast rights, which because they all got that was a problem too. The promoters all got their exclusive deals on these networks, and they held it as walled. They try to make them walled gardens like MMA, and it's just the product is not as interesting. And so they hurt themselves that way. So it's hard to feel sorry for a lot of the boxing stakeholders because they put themselves in the situation.
Right.
But as the industry, I do feel bad for the boxers, even the healthy industry. I would like something between the UFC and boxing, where maybe like a UFC sanctioning organization, where it's the number one sanctioning organization that ranks everybody. Everybody's excited, looks at them as the exclusive, but they don't control the promoters. But you brought up the pro wrestling one's really interesting, because you go through the history of why we have an Ollie Act, why boxing promoters can't control the titles. You have to go back to the International Boxing Club of New York antitrust case, and wrestling faced an antitrust case at the same time. Before, wrestling too had athletic commissions. They had boxing had the National Boxing Association, which was the predecessor to all the sanctioning organizations, where the athletic commissions got together, and they're the ones that sanctioned and made titles for the boxers. And so that was kind of basically one title. There's, the New York State Athletic Commission had their own too, but that was kind of like the one title era. And they did the same for wrestling, and wrestling kind of freaked out because they didn't want the athletic commissions to control that. So guys like Paul Bowser in the original AWA, not connected to the later one, created their fake sanctioning organization and handed out their own titles. So then the National Wrestling Alliance came along, and all the promoters got together and formed a cartel and a legal monopoly to control the title. And so they were going to be brought up as antitrust charges. But they told the FTC at the time, or the DOJ at the time, we are not we're not legitimate sport. And so they decided, well, we do not want to go after entertainment. We want to go after that's different than sporting. And so they gave them a pass on the antitrust front. Did not do what they did with the IBC of New York. And so there's no precedent set that you're using your titles to monopolize the sport, where the International Boxing Club of New York was found to be having a monopoly over championship matches. So lo and behold, you move forward. What does MMA do when the UFC shows up in the United States? They go, well, we're going to be like pro wrestling and just have our own titles. And because of that, there's this carve out that never was applied to pro wrestling, that's never applied to MMA. And so they're allowed to then engage in this behavior that monopolizes MMA. And now we are where we are, where we're now going, hey, why don't we bring that back to boxing, this thing that causes monopoly? So it's an interesting thing, where the links between the three are pretty fascinating, how they apply to each other, and how, because certain rules and laws were applied to one, not the other, we get these outcomes that we are today.
We'll end on this note. For people who want to combat this in some way, be it they don't like monopolies, or they want the boxers that they watch and are entertained by to have rights, and they care enough to for that to happen. Just how could, I guess, on two levels. One level, how could this be fought against if you're just a fan, just a consumer, perhaps just a journalist, would be to just covering this? But how could this be fought against on that level? And then on a grander level, what is the actual recourse that maybe the promoters have, that the boxers have, beyond just speaking out about it publicly now?
Well, for the public, I mean, I don't know how effective it's going to be, because, again, if Donald Trump supports this, the Republican Party will probably, especially the ones in the House, will follow suit. But it would be right to your congressman. And I think, too, the important thing to acknowledge is boxing does have problems. And perhaps this bill is not the solution, but could we do another bill? Could we bring back again the Professional Boxing Amendment Act that addressed the Ollie Act problems? Would be a solution. So you could ask for that too, and say, listen, I do not want this bill to go through, but if you want, introduce and do John McCain's bill that he introduced that would have fixed these problems. I think that's number one. If there's some sort of groundswell of the public, the big thing is getting the media interested in this. Unfortunately, if the media gets interested, it'll probably turn into a partisan issue where one side is against the other. That's the way we seem to divide the country now. But I think that the media, if you think about the Sarab, the conservative pundit, he wrote Tyranny Inc. This fits just in that a business gets to run the lives of their workers. It could appeal to people like that on the conservative side. It could appeal to the antitrust, anti-monopoly people. It could appeal to the pro-labor people. I think the story applies to so many different groups that you could get the message out, and hopefully gets picked up as because it serves as an analogy of what's happening to America. Then that gets some attention, and maybe it'll get defeated. Now, on the promoter side, the number one thing they could do is work together and produce a better product. Put pressure on the sanctioning organizations, right? They could do that. My fear is always the promoters always thinking for their own interest and how they can get a cut a piece of the deal and how they can take advantage of this. Yes, you can take advantage, but the number one thing you guys could work together, just like the NFL when they originally got together, is they did that to negotiate bigger TV deals, and you could do the same without being a cartel against your boxers. You could negotiate and work together to make sure you got, that you weren't going head to head all the time, so you got more audience viewership on each network that maybe you got on a network like HBO did, where it's not exclusive, where there's more co-promotion, so you can get a better TV deal that way. That's put a better product out. Work together to make a better product is their number one thing, and then use whatever influence you can to defeat this in Congress. A great poison pill, I think, would just amend one part, is that being a unified boxing organization does not give you an exemption from the Ali Act. It's not, you're still a promoter. You do that one thing, then unified boxing organizations, under the way they work, they couldn't offer contracts more than 1 year in length. I think that would be brilliant. I would actually support this bill if they had that the unified boxing organization's maximum length of their contracts could only be 1 year. Because I'm like, okay, great, do your system, show how great a promoters you are, but you cannot lock people into long-term contracts. And then the sanctioning organizations could just do a lot better fucking job. I mean, a lot better job. They're in fact, I would not be against maybe asking the ABC to come back and start sanctioning titles again. We get rid of the sanctioning organizations that way. I would, for boxers, my dream, and I think it's a pipe dream because MMA fighters and boxers, just the nature of the sports make this hard. Boxers could work together to create an association, which would give them leverage to lobby Congress for bills like this, would also let them, an association as standing, so they could by themselves enforce the Ali Act independently. They wouldn't need the athletic commissions. They could also create their own sanctioning organization, so they don't have to pay the fees to someone else. They would pay a fee. Maybe if they paid a sanctioning fee, it would go to something like a pension fund or something for the boxers. So that would be an option. Probably that would be the best option, to tell you the truth, the boxers do that. That's the least likely outcome, though. But I guess for the boxers is to speak out, but I am not sure, based on the experience of MMA, current boxers are not going to see the problem with this because they might make more under the new group, and it's only future generations that will suffer from the choices made by current boxers. But it is prize fighting, and so I at the same time, I can't blame them for going for the prize.
We've never been more capitalist. I think is the thing. Like guys will ultimately just, what's the route that I can make the most money, and then just take that route. Like, and that's part of the problem, right? Like,
I can't knock boxers and promoters. That's their job. It's prize fighting. This is purely mercenary behavior by them. The people that I really get mad at are the ABC, the Athletic Commission, and especially the sanctioning organizations, because the sanctioning organizations in their bylaws, they're supposed to promote boxing. They're the ones that are there to make sure it's treated like a sport.
Right.
And they are the ones that have failed miserably at that job. That it's, that their job is to make sure it's a meritocratic process and that those titles could have been used to as regulations, as a way to influence promoters and boxers to do the right thing. But instead, they handed out multiple titles like candy. They did shitty sanctioning title rankings. They obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but very likely took payments behind the scenes under the table on behalf of certain people. But so they have failed miserably. They're the ones that have dropped the ball more than, if they had done their job, boxing wouldn't have been in the state it's in.
And I just think, like, and I've even said for years before this happened that somebody was going to try to monopolize the sport in this way, because boxing allowed it to happen. You mentioned the exclusivity deals. Like, we remember in the mid 2010s, early 2010s, for example, where it's like HBO had Top Rank and Showtime had, PBC or I guess it wasn't PBC yet. But like their exclusive deal, Golden Boy and whatever. And they would go head to head oftentimes, where we would constantly be like, hey, why doesn't this person from this promotion fight this person from this promotion, instead of them fighting these constant stay busy fights at the same exact time on the same exact evening? And then after a while, like, you just let yourself open for something like this to happen.
Yeah, it makes sense from a promoter's point of view, because you have a limited number of fighters that draw a lot of money. and you're terrified if they lose, then you're down one of your limited number of fighters that draw money. And so they're very protective, but that leads to the problems we're having. And the sanctioning organizations, if they'd limited, not given out tons of extra belts, if they had the title, the rankings were as good as possible, and they made sure that the right mandatories were made, and that they were stripping people instead of letting them, like Canelo, keep the title for long periods of times without fighting against the proper opponents. Listen, I'm not one to say boxers, you have to make boxers fight. You know, they're not indentured servants. That's my problem with MMA, is these guys get trapped into contracts and they're like, well, if you don't fight this person, we're just going to sit you on the shelf forever. I think boxers, you know, fighters should have the right to choose who they want to fight. But if you're a champion, you have obligations if you want to remain champion. And they never use the leverage that the championship got to make sure co-promotion and better fights get made. So that's my big gripe on that. And the promoters too, you know, that because they kept their guys in these walled gardens they tried to build, you know, it killed the ratings. Who wants to subscribe to 4 or 5 networks where all of them are against none of them are putting on the fights you really want to see? And that's been the problem. You know, boxing, combat sports, the health of combat sports can be explained pretty easily. How recent was the last big fight, and how soon is the next big fight going to happen? And if you're not, I mean, that drives everything. That drives the water cooler talk. That drives the interest. And if you're not putting on the big fights, if they're few and far between, or if they're happening in a place that no one's on a network, DAZN, no one has, or in a place, Saudi Arabia, that no one pays attention to, really, that kills the media attention, then it's not in a healthy spot. That's why we're at where we're at, because there's just not enough big fights.